Well, one of the things Augustine does, this is a partial answer to your question, is in his polemics against Pelagius, he uses the terminology Catholic. In those days, we're not talking Roman Catholic, we're talking the Holy Catholic in the sense of universal Christian church. He's very anxious to show how what I'm teaching and saying over against what Pelagius is teaching belongs to the teaching of Scripture, firstly, but as well the tradition of the church. And he's anxious to show and illustrate that from any number of the sermons and writings of his predecessors among the church fathers. And I think that's particularly significant. It goes to a point I made some time back in the introductory discussion, that one thing I hope readers of the book will take away is the Catholicity of this teaching. The church condemned at Ephesus Pelagianism as a heresy. At the Synod of Orange, I mentioned that briefly in my book, there's a movement, there's a semi-Pelagian party that arises in the church and then eventually comes to have predominance in the later Middle Ages, prior to the time of the Reformation. But the Reformation was, in one respect, broadly speaking, a rediscovery of the biblical Pauline Augustinian heritage of the Catholic Christian Church, so that all of the reformers are appealing to Augustine again and again. I may have lost your question in part of my
No, not at
answer
all.
there.
I mean, but it's the polemical context seems to have given rise to his particular formulation.
Yes,
and
yes,
so it's
that's-
forged in the midst of that controversy. And so it's just a hypothetical, or it's counterfactual, but you wonder if the doctrine would have been formed in such a way had he not had that polemical context. And you see how
that's a hypothetical. It is a counterfactual. But this question illustrates something I often try to impress upon my students. Harnack is famous for his dictum as a classic liberal theologian. Dogma in its conception and development is the fruit of the Greek spirit on the soil of the gospel. Well, there's a Venema dictum, and it goes like this: dogma in its conception and development is the fruit of the church's reflection upon Scripture in confrontation with heresy or error.
Right.
In other words, in God's providence, this topic so central in Scripture and in the church's confession comes to the foreground, and it's compelled. Augustine has to take a pen and write in response, and Augustinianism prevails in the church. Really prevailed among the best theologians of the church's tradition right up until the time of the Reformation, and then was completely dominant among the leading reformers. So that this is a historical, somewhat punchy observation. Arminianism was regarded, certainly by that company of delegates who attended the Synod of Dort, which is the closest thing you come to a truly ecumenical Reformed Church Synod in history since the time of the Reformation. The language creeps up, the specter or the face of Pelagianism is rearing its ugly head. In other words, there was a long tradition, I think it's pretty much faded in the Roman Catholic Church at the present time, but the angelic doctor, even, just to throw in another name, Thomas Aquinas, was an Augustinian on the subject of election.
Yeah.
So we're not talking about this historical polemic that goes, this is some oddity, idiosyncratic emphasis of Reformed Christians. I think it profoundly illustrates a loss of historical awareness. The real innovators and those who were going back to what the early church already confronted and at an ecumenical council had rejected, Pelagianism, which at the end of the day, whether in its full-blown Pelagian or semi-Pelagian form, says that when a person decides to believe and do what is required through the gospel call, they're in a little room all by themselves. God is on the outside looking in. even if he may be looking in from a distance, in a manner of speaking, in
From
his
eternity.
foreknowledge.
Who knows? Yeah.
In his eternal foreknowledge. And he's boxed out. And there's a small room where the ultimate decision of whether one is saved or not saved is being made, and God has nothing to do with it. Let's be perfectly frank about that. What determines whether anyone is saved or not saved is what sinners in that little room, where they have the power, mimicking God's aseity of self-existence, to act from themselves. I mean, Arminius and the Arminians said, at the time of the Arminian controversy, that God only concurs in that free decision to believe or not to believe in its effect, not in its moving cause, which makes God less than properly omnipotent, limits his providence. There are acts that occur on the part of a creature. I forget the name of the author whom I cite in my book on the Arminian controversy. Wrote an essay in Jets. I should have reread the book before our interview today. But he says that, in effect, the Arminian view grants to the sinner, in respect to this particular decision, whether to believe or not to believe, godlike attributes.
Oh, sure.
Of self-existence, of radical independence, nothing and no one, no circumstance, no pre-existing arrangement of things accounts for the decision that is made, or that one should persist in making that decision, which is equally important. You're all on your own. And it's not surprising that it's in its popular representation, that position has God on the outside looking in, as a spectator waiting for you to make the all-important decision that lies outside of his power to grant it or to prevent it or whatever. Now, I've gone off into some polemicizing as it relates to a later chapter in the book, but since Arminianism is a form, a new form, a moderated expression of Pelagianism, the issues that Augustine was addressing
Same issues.
continue to recur.
Series of footnotes.
Series of footnotes, exactly. I forgot to mention that. That's an important point.
That's good.
The history of theology, certainly on this topic, is a series of footnotes. My book is a footnote.
To Augustine and Pelagius.
I have to say, I mentioned it earlier, rereading Augustine was a great pleasure to read those anti-Pelagian treatises.